two world champions. They happen to be twin brothers.
Well, the ingredients are there. Two guys who love to sit down to their punches and throw that firepower.
I'm not scared of nobody, and I'm definitely not scared of someone who talks to me. There's no one in the division that can beat me. There's no one in the division that's strong as me.
It would definitely deliver a statement. The power is for real. We would get a chance to let everyone in the world see the great things that me and my twin brother has done for the sport of boxing.
Oh! Charlo just dropped Lubin!
Being on the same card gives us energy. We want to be sharp. We want to be at our best.
We're going to both meet in the middle of the ring, and we're going to let our hands go. Let the best man win.
They are boxing. And they pound for pound.
Over the weekend, UFC Vegas 11 took place. In your main event, Brian, I will go to you first. Tyron Woodley losing essentially via TKO fifth round injury, but as you know, the story of the fight was that Colby Covington basically walked away with it, especially as the fight more or less wore on. Let's start with the first question here, Brian. Should Tyron Woodley retire?
Yeah, 1,000%. We can bring out the Prince Nassim meme and be like, I know it's too harsh. I think he should finish. Unfortunately, he should have finished a while ago. It took us a while to really figure out. Whoa. Hopefully people didn't hear that same echo I did in my ear. It took us a while to figure out, was that one bad night against Usman? Was that two bad nights against Gilbert Burns? No, it's over. Unfortunately, it's over. Tyron Woodley, as Dana White basically alluded to, he should be done. And I know in this case, Luke, there is that whole thing about the rib injury, the broken rib. And I'm not saying that's not legit, right? But that did happen somewhat later in the fight, and it just comes to a certain point where you can't lean on that as some sort of crutch or excuse, and I'm not necessarily saying Tyron did to try to say, look, that fight could have gone differently, or really the rest of my career could go differently. It can't. His fighting spirit has been extinguished, Luke. It's not that he's not a real man and not a warrior. I mean, look, he took punishment against Gilbert Burns, and like he patted himself on the back this past week, he did go 5 rounds and finish the fight. But the point is, he's not willing to pull the trigger anymore. He's not willing to risk it all and find out what he needs to do in order to win these fights. It's like he goes in there, Luke, he tests the temperature of the water. He says, I'm not going to be able to win this fight on my own terms, so I'm just going to survive. And that doesn't work, certainly at the elite level. That's how you're going to get yourself hurt. And to be even more critical, because this is our job, that's how you produce really boring fights, which for the most part, this fight was. Even though, to be honest, Woodley did let his hands go more against Colby than I think he did against Kamaru and Gilbert Burns combined. It's tough for me to see this because I've been on the Tyron bandwagon for a while, okay? There are very few, Luke, extended championship reigns in this promotion's history. This is why we need to bow down at the altar of the John Joneses, Amanda Nunes, GSP, those type of fighters who've been able to package wins over such a long period of time. Tyron Woodley had a great welterweight title run. I don't want to hear it from anybody. A great one. He figured out how to beat all of these fighters in that 4-5 defense run that he had by beating them at their own strength. But he's not that guy anymore. And I love him. I want to give him historically the respect he deserves as one of the better champions in UFC's modern history here. But it's not only over, Luke. It was probably over in round 1 against Usman. We just didn't know it. Something happened during that stretch. We could say the rap album. We could say the TMZ show. We can say a lot of things. He's also in his late 30s. You can get old overnight. It can be physically or it can be mentally. And I think more than anything, this is mentally. He doesn't want to be there in there anymore, Luke, and I don't think he should be.
I mean, people talk about how boring the Woodley versus Maia fight was, and I'm not here to endorse that view, but I am here to say it is certainly a perception among some fans. In that fight, Tyron Woodley landed nearly 60 significant strikes. I don't think he landed 60 combined in the last 2 of them. Here are some of the numbers here. I mean, he might have hit 60, but barely. The last 3 fights were all 5-round fights, right? 34 strikes he landed against Usman, 28 against Woodley, 34 against Burns, 34 against Covington. He got his guard passed in total 12 times during the course of those 3 fights. He's been taken down 8 times in the course of those 3 fights. He had a submission attempted against him for the first time, really, in his whole, I think, UFC career. No, I think Till attempted one as well. No, actually, no, that's it. That's it. Just the one there. In any event, you're seeing numbers here in terms of his record low output and then record high output of his opponents. We have seen this in boxing a little bit more readily. When someone is at the end of the line, what is some of the trademark sort of tales that you can see, the signs that this is time to hang it up? And usually it's an unwillingness to offensively engage. They just stop throwing. The one that always comes to mind for me, I don't know why, but it sticks out in my mind, Brian Campbell, is Kermit Cintron. You could just tell at the end there, he just didn't want to throw anymore. And it's not like Woodley has been battered through the course of his career. Even in this fight, he didn't get battered. Covington scored less significant strikes than Burns, who scored less significant strikes than Usman. In some ways, it was maybe one of the better performances, minus the fifth-round injury. But the key here is he just doesn't have a willingness to offensively fight. A fight is sort of two sides, right? On the one hand, there's defense, which you have to really be mindful of because, hello, the other person is a paid professional athlete who is there to do some work. So understanding that that's a part of the responsibility is quite literally essential. But there's another half to it, which is the offensive side, which is really, frankly, the winning side. He's been doing a lot of defending and surviving. That is not sufficient. So you can look at the numbers. You can look at the body language. You can also look at just the fact that he's 38 years of age. He'll be 39 next April. He is the oldest UFC welterweight champion ever, and he held it into a later year than any other UFC champion at welterweight ever has. And that speaks highly to his ability to persevere and succeed in a frame that literally no one else ever could. It also tells you that maintaining that is going to be very, very, very difficult. If he were fighting 3-round fights, that means he would have lost 4 fights consecutively, 14 rounds, plus that last 15th round. That would have been 3 fights consecutively. He would have had a full-on shutout, and then a 5th fight where he would have lost the first round and then gotten stopped in the second. If he was on a 5-fight losing streak, almost anybody would say it's time. 14, basically 15 consecutive rounds of taking an L is the kind of broad swath of information you need to say it is time to begin to look for the exit door.
No, it's time to run through the exit door, Luke. Let's not pussyfoot around. It's time to kick that door open because this is such a unique fall off the cliff because as you sort of teased there, normally it's a guy getting knocked the hell out who still has the fighting spirit that we tell it's time to go. I don't think we've ever seen a guy lose the title in subsequent fights just on a failure to launch like this. This is as unique in terms of the wheel falling off as I can remember from an elite fighter, but it doesn't make it any less the same. Like you're saying, there's the exit. It's time to go.
Right, but this is also what you know from combat sports too, Brian. You get old overnight. It just kind of happens, just like that. Some can push that out. Some can find the fountain of youth for a second gear. Alistair Overeem, who we talked about the last time I was on the show. Those are real things. But in general, when you get old in this game, you just get old quickly, especially in a hyper-competitive division like 170 pounds. Listen, I believe you could make a very clear case that Tyron Woodley is the 3rd best UFC welterweight champion of all time. I would put Matt Hughes ahead of him based on the record of accomplishment, and certainly St. Pierre. But I think he probably is ahead of Pat Miletich, who would be the other sort of obvious choice there. That is a very, very, very good run. But the run has come to an end here, and it has been probably insulting to him to see what has happened in the last 2 fights before this one. Well, now we're adding injury to insult. This should not be able to continue anymore, and even Dana White said as much. Now, Brian, we go back to you. What about the other side of the equation? Colby Covington, again, didn't have the same output, at least from a statistical standpoint, that Gilbert Burns did. Certainly not as much as Kamaru Usman did. But he also got the injury stoppage, which, he was putting pressure on him. I'm not sure how much you can credit him for that. But, hey, he was winning that one walking away. He is ranked number 2 currently at welterweight. Should his next fight be a title shot?
It shouldn't, but it should be something that's arguably just as good. He should fight Jorge Masvidal next, Luke, and I'd be perfectly fine if it was a pay-per-view main event. I don't need an interim title thrown in there, but I think both would understand you're fighting for a chance to fight for a title. I'm glad that Dana White stuck to his guns and more or less confirmed that it's still going to be Gilbert Burns getting that shot at Usman. He deserves it. I don't want to hear the Leon Edwards arguments until he beats a top 5 guy, even though he's won 17 fights in a row. But I think that makes the most sense because Colby fought great. He did exactly what he had to do. Avoided the big shots, never got into any kinds of trouble, and just did what he does, which is grind. I don't think he should skip the line, even with the potential of the grudge match rematch and how good that first fight was against Kamaru Usman here. Gilbert Burns is red hot. Let's reward him. But I think you've got to go Colby against Masvidal. This is the most pure way, in my eyes, for Masvidal to get back to a title shot legitimately by going in there and beating a top guy and not just sort of, going, let's say, the Nate Diaz Part 2 route and then waiting around. I want to see Jorge carry out this serious side of his career, where it is now suddenly for him in his late 30s about trying to find out how great he can be. Well, I think, look, it's on him that he took that fight last minute, and you get both the rewards and the criticism that comes with it when he was unable to go out there and really give us 5 hard rounds. I think he's got to earn his way back in, and I'd much rather see him fight a Colby Covington, given the history between them. Look, Luke, this was supposed to be the grudge match of the century, Covington-Woodley, and for many different reasons that I'm sure we're going to get into in a second, it was not promoted the way you would think it would. It slipped in under the radar on the calendar like, oh, crap, that's this weekend? And that's a fight night main event? Good God, let's do it. I mean, this should have been a Super Bowl of kind of grudge and hate in good ways. There's different kinds. But I think you can still have that with Jorge, and I want to see that. That's the fight to make, but at the very least, look, Colby showed you right there that he is of the very elite in this division and honestly in this sport. I still think at the end of the day, he's Kamaru Usman light, and he wouldn't be able to get over that hill. But that's why we watched the fights. He pushed Kamaru for 5 incredible rounds in their first fight. They chose not to wrestle. They banged, brother. And I know he's got some of those controversy elements to lean on with the referee jumping in and all that. Mm-hmm. But I want to see him earn it and get back there. This was a huge first step against Woodley, but now he's got to do it, in my eyes, against a big one in Masvidal.
Let me pitch it right back to you, which is to say the following. I don't really disagree with anything you're saying. Look, you can't go wrong with Colby versus Jorge. And frankly, if it comes to it, you can't really go wrong with Colby versus Kamaru too. Now, I'm not saying that that's the best way to go, but he is ranked number 2. You saw them have this exchange post-fight on the ESPN Plus show. Obviously, he's a worthy adversary. Their first fight was actually kind of fun. So there's a lot of reasons why you could get away with that. But let me ask you this, Brian. We're all kind of banking on the idea that it is Kamaru Usman, and maybe, in fact, it will be, but we at least have to consider the possibility that it won't be. So what would you say should be next if Gilbert Burns wins? Because if you burn Colby versus Jorge, Leon's still waiting on a fight. Gilbert might not be able to get back into rotation very soon. You're kind of taking away a contender for someone who might need it, because I don't have a desire, short of some crazy circumstance, to see an immediate rematch between Burns and Usman if Burns wins in some kind of fairly legitimate way.
I think you stay on course. If Burns wins the title from Usman, I think you would have already scheduled Colby against Jorge if you go that direction, and then the winners fight each other. But obviously, UFC could take the route of leaving Colby as sort of the last-minute replacement should somebody miss weight in that fight. And if that's the case, you'd go right to Colby. Look, he's done this as close as you can come to deserving it. He's right there on the outside looking in. I have no problem with that, Luke. The potential problem is the other side of it, which I think it's worth getting into. I mean, I don't know if you saw this morning, Dan Le Batard led off his national show with this topic. I mean, bigger than Woodley's rib. It's the talk between them, and it's what's going on in terms of their mouths right now.
All right, so let's get into that. Let this be the last topic on this particular fight, but it's sort of a broader one more generally. As you guys may have seen, it's not been any kind of secret. Colby Covington has sort of turned himself into a Donald Trump mascot supporter, certainly, and Tyron Woodley has been very advocate on the very, very vocal, I should say, on the other side of things. Kamaru Usman a little bit less so. Still, there's a bigger and broader question here, where you had former UFC light heavyweight champion and Hall of Famer Tito Ortiz calling Tyron Woodley a terrorist. You had essentially Colby Covington signing off on it, calling him more of a terrorist sympathizer, but nevertheless saying these incendiary things. Brian, I'll go to you first. One more time here. The basic question is as follows. Should UFC regulate fighters' pre-fight speech?
Yes, to a point, Luke. It's hard to say hard and fast yes or no in this case, because I don't want it to be yes. I never want a situation where anyone has controlled speech. I want Colin Kaepernick to be able to put across his message on the NFL field as much as anybody else. I also love that fights in the fight game is a little bit different, right? We can trade non-PC words at each other because it's a fight at the end of the day, and half the job of a fighter, I'm sorry, it really is hyping up that fight. I do think, though, there are lines and limitations where if the UFC does not want to step in, then there are potential pitfalls and results of the conduct. And I think it goes back, Luke, to the debate you and I had back in the day on the great MMA Beat when Conor McGregor and Khabib Nurmagomedov were going back and forth. They got into the religion, it got into Khabib's wife, and it got to a certain level. And Luke, this was after UFC 229 when they had the attack in the cage, where I remember you and I asking each other, is this too far? Should Dana step in? At that point, we both agreed yes, and there was a reason. If you're going to allow that level of trash talk back and forth, you're going to have extended people, whether it's the camps of both fighters or the fan bases of both fighters, that aren't going to take that as typical trash talk, which is why we saw that brawl after 229. That, luckily for the UFC, was contained at a level where we are allowed to look back at history and be like, wow, wasn't that crazy? Khabib made Conor tap, and then they had to fight off each other in the cage. But let's not forget how freaking close that came to being the NBA Palace Brawl. And I don't care what you call me in response to that. I'll soy boy for up the nines for this. I was in the crowd, and Khabib's manager got tackled onto my laptop there in the front row of the media section, and ish was wild. People were jumping in from the crowd. That almost went into a full-on thing that the UFC would never want, right? You would never want fans to have fear of entering into an arena that they could basically be involved in the violence. So when I say that there is a limit, it's a soft yes. UFC has to put in some element here, because if a fighter wants to take a political stance, that's on them, right? As much as Dana wants to be like, we don't want to talk about COVID in the UFC. We want this to be a safe space where you can come in and not deal with the headlines of the real world and just focus on fights. Well, that's fine until you have fighters who really want to make a statement. And I know it doesn't look great, Luke, and it shouldn't, that the UFC happens to support the same cause that Colby does, so there's no problem in letting him run his mouth on the mic. I do think there's limits, though, when Colby has the kind of speech that he did both before and after this fight that seemed to go further than politics. When he's saying, I hate Tyron Woodley because he stands for everything I hate, like the BLM and all that, I think you're crossing a line into areas of hate. And it's not that I don't think someone should have a space to give their own stance on politics, religion, on life, on treatment, on anything, right? You want to make that stand, it's up to the UFC to pull the microphone eventually and give you that space for as long as they will. Just like when fighters get on the microphone and try to call out their sponsors, right? The announcer goes, okay, that's it. Great talking to you. Good win. There's a limit to things. If you don't put in those limitations, there may be consequences. And I think Colby, showed us, Luke, the pro wrestling side of him ahead of that Usman fight where he didn't do the trash talk like crazy. He admitted in that interview that this is all an act. Well, he's doubled down on that act to the point that it is gray. And I'm not here to tell you, like, the Colby character needs to go. We need villains in this sport. But if you're going to allow unlimited free speech, you are setting up the potential for consequences and results. I don't know whether it's violence outside the cage or the arena or whatever, but you're going to create volatile situations with that. It's a gray area, Luke, at best, but it's only going to take one bad consequence to sort of pull back and be like, there's a limit to trash talk here.
I mean, it reminds me of the debate around big tech, right? These platforms like YouTube and Facebook, and they allow these provocateurs, essentially on either side, to say incredibly inflammatory, often totally false, outrageous things. And there's a debate here. It's like, do we just allow them to say that, or does big tech step in and then censor them? Well, the problem with censorship is that once you allow big tech to start having a say over who gets to have a say, they begin to just essentially take out anything that's not a centrist element, and important voices that could be unfairly grouped with extremities of a fringe movement now lose out on their chance to voice opposition outside of the Overton window, right? So you don't really know what to do. But here's the problem. If you just let everybody have a voice and say whatever they want to say, now you get to a situation where you have these platforms which have proliferated across the world that have radicalized young people, and particularly young men, and it has turned them into, it has damaged democracy deeply. Not just here, but abroad as well. It is bad for society. It is bad for any kind of the social fabric is fraying in no small part because of the radicalization of the online platforms that are designed to maximize false, conspiratorial, and frankly damaging information. Now, Dana White asked a question at the post-fight press conference, who is more free speech than us? I would like to give an answer to that. When it comes to fighters saying what they want to, it is very true that they are very hands-off, perhaps to your point, Brian, to a fault. On the other hand, when it comes to criticism about the UFC, they're a little bit more like North Korea. This is an organization that is blackballed unapologetically, multiple reporters from multiple legitimate outlets. They made people sign COVID waivers, although I think a lot of that has gone away. Certainly in every UFC contract I've ever seen, there is a clause that prohibits fighters from discussing the specifics of their pay, and so on and so on. So to answer the question about who cares more about free speech than us, I would say relative to those concerns, literally anybody, literally anyone is more forgiving of that than them. The reason why I think that they let the fighters say what they say, remember, there's one key piece of the information here that's worth keeping in mind, BC, which is that on the books, the code of conduct is still there. They have previously fined fighters like Nate Diaz for anti-gay slurs. You can agree, you can not agree, but it did, in fact, happen. They have completely moved away from that. Why? The reason why they're so pro-free speech is not because they have some genteel idea about Madisonian politics and the way things should be in a free and equal society. It's because you begin to blur the line between independent contractor and employee, and they don't want to get sideways with that when they already have this lawsuit ongoing that appears to be headed in the plaintiff's direction. That's going to be the former fighters suing them for money. So what is the right answer here? Let me explain something to you very quickly. If you call Tyron Woodley a terrorist, there are two problems with that. Number one, the only people who can do that are profoundly stupid and totally unencumbered by the facts. That is a reckless, absurd, fact-free assertion that does not deserve to be taken seriously, except for the second part, which is that it is incredibly dangerous. You keep letting people do stuff like this, and somebody is going to get hurt. I don't know if it's Tyron Woodley. I don't know if it's tomorrow. You allow rhetoric like this that is not merely dangerous because of what it says, but what it says is also totally false. We're going to have problems. These are people who, in this particular case, right-wing provocateurs, who like to just label people different from them with these incredibly awful labels, like Marxist, like communist. These are people who could not tell you anything about Marxism other than what Facebook told them. These are people who know nothing about communism other than what Facebook told them. And to be clear, communism has its own massive set of evils, and I am no Marxist. That is a thing that you cannot sign on to. But we're talking about deeply ignorant people sharing profoundly stupid ideas that also happen to be very, very dangerous. The UFC does need to step in when it comes to that. I don't know if they need to fine them or throw them in jail. I'm not suggesting that. But having a word with them might be a good idea, because this is a path to a very, very, very bad place. Last thing on this, BC.
Well,
hate speech
I don't
laws.
know. Maybe
Hold
we
on,
go an hour on
last thing. Hate speech laws in this country never survive judicial review. I know we got to move on. They never survive judicial review. You can't pass laws, or even as a private entity, rules about this. They won't survive in court. I'm not suggesting as much. I'm not calling for anyone to lose their job. I'm not calling for anyone to be fined. But a level of decency, a norm that you stick to, if you lose sight of that, you are in big, big trouble. And we are tumbling down that hill at record speed.
Right, and it's tough. It's a gray area when, again, UFC and Dana White are extremely pro-Trump. So anything Colby does with the red hat on, it starts to look like they're backing that as well. And by the way, just so we can say this, Colby talking to Donald Trump on the phone is like a fun viral moment, as far as I'm concerned.
Sure.
Colby, though, on the microphone going level of terrorist, and basically, I mean, look, there were some things he said that almost sounded straight up hatred of black people. And I know, and that's just the way it is. And that's how it can be perceived. And I don't think that's any different, Luke, than somebody, a fighter after a win, holding up a Bible and saying all gay people should burn. It's kind of stuff that if you're a brand, and the UFC is, you've got to determine what is smart and right for you, both financially and in terms of the message that you're sending that will affect ratings. And right now, it's easy to throw a lot of shade at UFC because Colby and Dana are sort of on the same side of this, but you got to be crazy super careful. And you know, Luke, the second that this would affect a major sponsor, you'd see a tightening You'd see and I want to ask you straight up, Luke, do you think it would be okay if Dana and company went the opposite level and said, forget this crap? No, we're only talking fights inside the fights fair. We're not losing sponsorships. We're not starting fights. We're not doing anything. We fight. We talk about fights in here. I don't want to hear about your politics, your sponsors, your religion, anything like that. We may have to get to that level if this keeps up and it breeds something, Luke.
Again, I don't think passing rules, I mean, they already have the code of conduct. They just don't enforce it. Beginning to enforce that again, I think gets to a very bad place, both for them and, frankly, the sport. You are right. This is combat sports. People have a right to be rude and mean and, frankly, awful to each other. What they don't have a right to do is, and I'm not saying we've gotten there yet, but if we keep going, we will. What they don't have a right to do is endanger health and safety. You don't have a right to do that. And to the extent that we get to a point where we allow this kind of climate to get worse, we are headed to a bad place. So all I'm suggesting is having some kind of norm respected, if at all possible, is a much healthier way to go.